Everyone knew the image, the elegant princess, the daughter of Hollywood royalty, the woman photographed on yachts, at galas beside kings, presidents, and billionaires. From the outside, the life of Princess Caroline of Monaco looked almost unreal, like something pulled from an old European fairy tale. But behind the diamonds, behind the palace walls, and behind the carefully controlled royal appearances was a woman who spent much of her life carrying grief that never fully left her. Before she was even old enough to speak, her existence had already become political. Before adulthood, she was swallowed by public pressure. Before 35, she had buried the two people who shaped her world the most. And somehow, after everything, she kept standing. The story of Caroline is not really about royalty. It is about survival. It is about what happens when a person grows up surrounded by privilege but starved of emotional freedom. And it is about how tragedy can follow someone for decades while the world continues expecting them to smile through it. Caroline was born on January 23, 1957, inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco. Even her birth carried enormous weight. Monaco was tiny, vulnerable, and politically fragile at the time. The royal family was not simply a symbol. It was tied directly to the country's survival. Because of agreements with France dating back decades, the question of succession mattered deeply. If there was no stable royal line, Monaco risked losing part of its independence. So when Caroline arrived, newspapers across Europe did not simply celebrate the birth of a baby girl. They analyzed what her birth meant for the future of an entire nation. Before she even opened her eyes, she belonged to the public. That pressure shaped the atmosphere she grew up in. Her mother, Grace Kelly, had already become one of the most famous women in the world before marrying Prince Rainier III. She had beauty, success, awards, and one of the biggest careers in Hollywood. Then suddenly, she gave all of it up to become Princess of Monaco. To the public, it looked romantic, but people close to Grace later described something more complicated. Palace life was disciplined, formal, and emotionally controlled. Grace stepped out of Hollywood freedom and into centuries of royal expectation. By the time Caroline was born, her mother was no longer simply Grace Kelly. She was Her Serene Highness. And those two identities were not always easy to reconcile. Meanwhile, Prince Rainier ruled Monaco with relentless focus. He wanted the principality modernized, profitable, and internationally respected. His days revolved around business meetings, state duties, tourism development, and political strategy. Inside the palace, duty often came before warmth. Caroline grew up surrounded by luxury, but emotional closeness was harder to find. Meals were formal. Schedules were strict. Public appearances mattered constantly. Even as a child, she learned quickly that image came first. Then everything shifted again. In 1958, her younger brother Albert II was born. Under Monaco's succession laws at the time, a younger male heir immediately outranked an older sister. Almost overnight, Caroline lost the position she had unknowingly been born to hold. She went from future ruler to secondary heir before she could even fully understand what that meant. It may have happened too early for her to process consciously, but emotionally, that kind of shift leaves marks. The pressure remained. The public attention remained, but certainty disappeared. As Caroline got older, she became known as the responsible child, the serious one, the polished daughter expected to represent Monaco perfectly. Her days filled with etiquette, education, royal appearances, and endless expectations about behavior. And because her parents were often emotionally distant, one of the strongest bonds in her childhood became her nanny. People close to the family later recalled how attached Caroline and Albert became to her. In many ways, she provided the emotional consistency the palace lacked. That contrast defined much of Caroline's early life. She lived in one of the most glamorous homes in Europe, yet often felt emotionally isolated inside it. Education became both an escape and another form of discipline. Caroline attended elite schools, studied in Paris, and eventually entered the Sorbonne, where she focused on philosophy, psychology, and biology. She was intelligent, academically gifted, and highly disciplined. Teachers reportedly admired her seriousness and intellectual ability, but the world outside cared less about her mind than her image. By the late 1970s, Caroline had transformed into one of Europe's biggest royal celebrities. Paparazzi followed her constantly. Fashion magazines adored her. Every dress, relationship, hairstyle, and public appearance became headline material. The more she tried to experience ordinary youth, the more extraordinary public fascination became. Paris nightlife became one of the few places where she seemed able to breathe. Clubs, parties, and social circles offered temporary freedom from palace expectations. But even there, cameras followed. Soon the media began creating a simplified version of her identity. Instead of intelligent, educated, and thoughtful, they pushed the image of a glamorous party princess. It frustrated her deeply. The harder the palace worked to protect and polish her public image, the more Caroline rebelled against it. She skipped engagements, resisted control, and pushed against royal expectations whenever she could. Then came the relationship that shocked her family. In 1978, at just 21 years old, Caroline married Philippe Junot, a French businessman nearly 2 decades older than her. To her parents, he represented exactly the wrong kind of man, flashy, unstable, deeply connected to nightlife culture and surrounded by rumors. But Caroline moved forward anyway. The wedding became a massive international event. Cameras flashed everywhere. Monaco delivered the grand spectacle the world expected from royalty. Yet, underneath the glamour, tension filled the palace. According to later reports, Grace Kelly privately feared the marriage would fail. And sadly, those fears proved correct almost immediately. One of the cruelest moments came when private honeymoon photographs reportedly found their way into tabloids. For Caroline, the betrayal cut deeply. She had spent her whole life being watched by strangers. Now, even her private intimacy no longer felt safe. The marriage collapsed quickly. By 1980, they were divorced. Caroline was still only 23 years old, publicly humiliated, emotionally wounded, and trapped between royal expectations and personal disappointment. Then tragedy struck the family in a way nobody could fully prepare for. In September 1982, Grace Kelly died following the devastating car crash that shocked the world. For Monaco, it felt like the end of an era. For Caroline, it was far more personal. Her mother's death shattered something inside the family forever. Grace had always seemed trapped between two worlds, Hollywood and royalty, freedom and obligation. And although their relationship had not always been emotionally easy, Caroline loved her deeply. Suddenly, the woman who had defined Monaco's image for decades was gone. The grief changed Caroline permanently, and during that painful period, another person entered her life. Stefano Casiraghi was very different from the men Caroline had previously known. He came from a wealthy Italian family, but unlike many around royalty, he did not seem fascinated by titles or status. People noticed immediately how different Caroline seemed around him. For the first time in years, she looked genuinely relaxed. Stefano was warm, energetic, athletic, and confident without appearing controlling. Friends later described their connection as immediate and deeply natural. Caroline herself would eventually describe it almost like a fairy tale. After years of pressure, loneliness, and emotional instability, Stefano brought calm into her life. They married in 1983. The ceremony itself was smaller and more restrained than many expected. There was no grand religious wedding because Caroline's previous marriage had still not been annulled by the Vatican. But emotionally, it felt like a fresh beginning. Together, they built something Caroline had rarely experienced growing up: warmth. Their children soon followed. Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre became the center of their world. Friends and journalists began describing the household as unusually loving and normal compared to traditional royal dynamics. Stefano adored Caroline. He protected her privacy fiercely and reportedly helped make palace life feel less cold and institutional. For a while, happiness seemed real, but there was always one shadow hanging over their lives. Stefano loved offshore powerboat racing. The sport was extremely dangerous, and Caroline hated the risks that came with it. Stefano raced at terrifying speeds across violent waters, often pushing both machinery and human limits to extremes. He loved the adrenaline. Caroline feared the consequences. Then came October 1990. Off the coast near Monaco, Stefano's racing boat crashed during competition. The vessel flipped violently. His co-pilot survived. Stefano did not. He was only 30 years old. The news devastated Monaco, but for Caroline it was catastrophic. She had already lost her mother. Now she lost the man many believed was the emotional center of her life. And the tragedy felt especially cruel because Stefano had reportedly discussed stepping away from racing. When Caroline returned dressed in black, she was no longer simply a princess. She was a widow with 3 very young children. Andrea was 6, Charlotte was 4, Pierre was only 3. The images from that period became unforgettable. The grief on her face looked overwhelming, almost unreal. People who saw her afterward described someone transformed by loss. And then darker rumors began spreading. Some claimed Stefano had received threats before the race. Others whispered about sabotage, organized crime connections, or business disputes. Investigations looked into the possibility, but officials ultimately ruled the crash an accident. Still, the mystery never fully disappeared from public imagination. For Caroline, though, the official explanation probably mattered less than the emptiness left behind. She withdrew almost completely after Stefano's death. Leaving Monaco for long periods, she focused entirely on protecting her children from the chaos surrounding the royal family and media attention. Friends described her during those years as quieter, thinner, emotionally exhausted. But something remarkable happened during that darkness. Instead of collapsing publicly, Caroline slowly redirected her pain into work. Even before Stefano's death, she had already begun charity and humanitarian efforts focused on children and emotional support services. Afterward, those commitments deepened. She became heavily involved in organizations connected to child welfare, education, the arts, and humanitarian outreach. One of her most important projects focused on helping vulnerable young people struggling with addiction, abuse, neglect, and emotional crisis. Thousands eventually relied on those services. At the same time, she stepped into many of the cultural responsibilities once carried by Grace Kelly. She supported ballet programs, artistic foundations, orchestras, and educational initiatives across Monaco. Slowly, public perception of Caroline changed. She was no longer seen only as the glamorous royal daughter or tragic widow. She became viewed as something steadier, a survivor. But life still refused to become simple. In the 1990s, Caroline entered another controversial relationship, this time with Ernst August. From the beginning, the romance generated enormous scandal because he was still married when rumors first emerged. European tabloids exploded with coverage. Society gossip treated the relationship like royal drama unfolding in real time. Eventually, they married in 1999 and later welcomed their daughter Alexandra. But this relationship carried a very different energy from her marriage to Stefano. Where Stefano had brought warmth and calm, Ernst August became increasingly associated with controversy, public outbursts, aggression, and instability. Over the years, reports about his behavior grew darker. There were scandals involving alcohol, angry confrontations, threats, and highly publicized incidents that embarrassed both Caroline and Monaco. At one point, his behavior reportedly became so alarming that it led to psychiatric treatment. Once again, Caroline found herself trapped between public dignity and private turmoil. And then another devastating blow arrived. In 2005, Prince Rainier III died after serious health complications. For Caroline, it marked the end of another enormous chapter of her life. Despite the emotional distance that sometimes existed